Okay, hey folks, Mark Locklear here with a screencast on Chapter 2. We talked a little bit about setting our environment up in Chapter 1, so hopefully you should be okay there. I'm at a console here and I'm going to use RVM here. Just show you real quick just some RVM tools and tips. I mentioned RVM in the book. That stands for Ruby Version Manager. You can check that out on the web if you just do a Google search on Ruby RVM. You should be able to find it. You can do RVM list, and that will show you the versions of Rubies that you've got installed. And then you can also do RVM gem set list, and that should show you any gem sets that are associated with a particular version of Ruby that you've got. But generally, when you're working in your environment, just as a sanity check, you can do Ruby dash V, and that's going to show you the version of Ruby you're using, and then you can also do Rails dash V, and then that you can see here I'm using Beta 2. By the time you're watching this, you should be on into the regular release version of Rails 5 or maybe even Rails 5.1. Okay, so let's talk about Chapter 2. So in the last chapter, we just created a very basic vanilla Rails app. Didn't add any views, no model view controller, nothing like that. So the way we're going to start is by creating a simple controller, and we're going to use generators in Rails to do that. And so what's going to happen is essentially we're going to get a controller and then an associated view with that controller. Okay, so let's just jump right in, and I'll just sort of talk about it as I go. So I'm going to create a new Rails app here. So I'm going to do Rails new, and I'm just going to do chapter 2. Generally, when you create a new Rails app like this, you're going to see number one, it's going to show you the files that were created. It's going to show you the gems you see here, and then generally bundle is going to run too. So now I'm going to change directory into chapter 2, and I'll be using Sublime Text throughout these screencasts. Sublime Text is a really robust and very popular text editor that's available free. Um, and so I would encourage you to download and use that. And I'll sort of try to walk you through as I use Sublime Text. I'll try to walk you through some of the hotkeys and things like that I use as I'm working in Sublime. So you can see here, this is the general structure of our Rails app. We may come back and talk a little bit more about this, but generally you've got an app, folder, and that's where most of your sort of stuff that your the sort of guts of your Rails app. Most of that stuff lives inside the app folder, and then you've got a models. If you notice, you've got a models, controllers, and views folder inside that folder. Okay. So now let's go back. Let's go back to our text, and let's look at what we want to do here. So as I mentioned, we just created a simple hello, sort of a hello world app. Not really a hello world app because we didn't add any kind of text or anything to it. We just created a vanilla Rails app with no models, views, or controllers. So what we're going to do in chapter 2 here is create a new Rails app, and all right, we've created a new Rails app. We're going to generate a new controller that's called hello, and it's going to have a single action of index. And so that's sort of what we're going to do here. So in fact, I'm just going to copy and paste this to prevent against fat fingering. So this is going to run, and let's just generally talk about what we've done here. So let's talk about first the syntax of what we've done. So of course, Rails is the command. You installed Rails in chapter 1. So basically any commands that you sort of give at the command line here are going to be going to be coming from the Rails gem and the framework itself. This generate command, you can also, you'll see me sometimes do a sort of a shortcut for that is just G. You can just use the word G, and you'll probably see me do that. It says that, hey, we're going to run a generator. The next thing we add, the next argument we pass in is the keyword controller. That just says, hey, we want to generate a controller. And then we also pass in the name of the controller and the action. Okay, and then we can see here these are all of the files that were created as a part of this generate command. And let's shoot over to Sublime Text and sort of look at those. You'll see me in Sublime Text use a lot of, I'm on Mac, so I'm using Command T, and that's to do a file search. And so I'm going to start typing hello, and let's look at the hello controller first. Okay, so let me pop back over here. So remember, the command we ran was Rails generate controller hello index. So that said, hey, we're going to create a controller. The name is going to be hello, and that's what we see here. Notice you have this uppercase H hello controller. So that's where the name comes from, this name we passed in here. If we'd have said Rails generate controller blah index, then this would have been called blah controller. Okay, and then index is going to be the single action that we've added to this controller. So in this case, that's why we had this def index here. And you can also think of it as a method. If you think of methods in other language, those terms are the terms action and method are sort of used interchangeably in Rails, at least when we talk about controller methods that are in our controllers. We generally call those actions. Okay, so notice also, in addition to this controller, we also have a view that was created here. And in fact, if we load that, we'll load index. So first off, notice the path here. This lives in app views hello, and then notice this hello is based on the controller name, since that's what we said we wanted the controller name to be. You've got an associated folder with that controller. So in this case, because it's the hello controller, you've also got a folder in views called hello, and generally, and it just depends on if the actions have views associated with them. In this case, they do. Along with that index action, we have an index view here. And then if you'll notice, let me click on that. If you'll notice here, we've just got some sort of boilerplate text that's inside this view, and we'll actually see that when we load it inside the web browser. So we'll pop back over to a terminal window, and we're going to run. So here we did this in chapter 1. Remember, we can run Rails server. Notice you can also, there's a shortcut, you can run Rails S here, and that's going to run your server, your Puma server in Rails. And so you notice here it tells you, hey, we're running at localhost 3000. So if I go over here to localhost 3000 and I load this page, boom, we get this this default welcome page. Now this page may look a little different for you guys, just depending on what version of Rails you're running. So don't be alarmed if you see a little different page, but you should get some page. You should see something running on this page, and not any kind of error message. So notice this is the same thing we saw with our default app that we created in chapter 1, having not created a generator. So what we need to do here is we need to actually add our route in here, and in this case we're going to type hello and then /index. So now this loads our our index view, and remember, over in Sublime Text, this is the same text we saw here. So in fact, I could say, if I change this, just so sort of sanity check, hello all, I'm going to save that. Notice I come back here and refresh, and notice how this text changes up here. So I just want to sort of show that, hey, this view, this view in app views hello index is the same view we're seeing here. Now let's go back to our text here. And so we've done all that. Notice I asked you to change this route here, and in fact I'm going to copy this. So let's go over to Sublime, and we're going to go to our routes.rb file, and I'm going to paste this route in here. Now notice the differences here. So by default, when we use the generator to create a new controller and that action, by default Rails gives us this route. Now we'll talk a little later in the class about what this routes.rb file does, but essentially you can think of it as, when you think about routes, just think about the URL in the web browser. And basically basically what happens here is when a user goes in and types in any kind of URL or web address, the first thing Rails does is compares that address against this routes file. So in this case, it's saying, hey, if the user types in hello / index, which we did here, then that's a valid route, and it says, hey, find the hello controller and then find the hello action within the controller, and then we're going to also load the index view. So that's what that does. Let's comment this out, and if you notice in Ruby, if we want to comment something out, we just use that sort of hash or pound symbol. So I'm going to comment that out, and let's get a little formatting going here so that looks a little neater. So I just saved this route file, and notice how this is going to change our route. So now, in fact, let's go ahead and reload this page. So we're going to get an error now. We're going to get a routing error because essentially Rails is saying, hey, I don't understand this route. I don't understand this web address that you've typed in. But if I go and I take the index off the end and I hit return, notice it loads that same view for us. So essentially these two things do the same thing. They're just sort of, this is just a way to sort of clean up the route some such that all the user has to type in is /hello, and then we're going to get this associated view. I want to say a few words about Model View Controller. So you've probably, if you've been around web development at all, you've probably heard about Model View Controller, and it's just sort of a way of thinking about web development from a conceptual standpoint, but it also has real world implications. We talked about Sublime Text earlier, and if you just look at the sort of file and folder structure over here on the left, all Rails apps have these folders by default. As you go on to add controllers, models, views, and different things, then the files inside the model view controller folders will change. But this is one of the advantages of Rails. Now a lot of people don't like this, and they may they may for some people it turns them off of Rails that it's as structured as it is, and the term in the industry is sort of it's that Rails is opinionated software. And what it means by that is, again, every Rails app has the same structure. Now, the advantage to that is that I can be a new developer and I can find a Rails app on GitHub, or I can go to work for a new company who uses Rails, and I can very quickly come up to speed, right? Because I know exactly where the models live. I know exactly where the controllers live. I know where the views live. In some general sort of way. Every Rails app is going to be unique, and it's going to have its own little ways of doing things, but generally the structure you see here is what you're going to see for every Rails app, and that is an advantage. I don't care what anyone says there. So the history, you can read the little section in the book, History of Model Views. Model View Controller sort of goes back to the 70s. It only sort of is really taken off in the last 10 years or so. And Rails has really been sort of the gold standard of how to implement MVC in a sort of real way. So let's talk about each one of these things real quick. Model, generally when we think about the model, just think database. Model is the term we use in Rails and maybe some other frameworks use, but generally when we think about the model, think about the database. View is just what we said. It's sort of the view that the user sees on the screen. So we talked about in this app we've just created here in chapter 2, the default view, the default index view for the hello controller that we created. Now this is not very pretty, but as we go on and make more sophisticated apps, we'll sort of add more things to our view. And then of course the controller is this sort of sometimes called the business logic, but the controller sort of sits between the model and the view, and sort of contains the logic that that goes on in these various pieces. Now this doesn't mean that there won't be times when you'll have logic inside the view, because there will be, generally speaking, that's a bad thing, but there'll be times when you'll do it, even if it's something as simple as an if-else statement. And then the same for the model. You'll also have logic there. Sometimes there'll be methods, or there'll be methods that'll be called from the controller that sort of live in the model. So there's various configurations out there, but generally that's sort of the structure that we think of. Okay. So in addition to model view controller, let's also talk about our folders. We sort of looked at those. You can see a list of these in the book. I won't go into all of them. I'll just sort of quickly cover a few of the high points. So make sure I've got Sublime going here. So I've already talked about the app folder. The big ones here, and I think the only ones I'll mention are going to be the model view and controllers folders. Those are the big ones we're going to focus on. We'll talk about assets some later in the book, and then we'll also talk about um, mailers at some point too. But the model view controllers are the big ones that we'll be talking about inside the app folder. In addition to that, the config folder. So generally, this is sort of the environment variable type stuff that lives within Rails. This is sort of the base level configuration, sort of environment configuration type things live in the config folder. The database folder generally is going to, if you're in this case, we're using SQLite. That's sort of the default database that you use with Rails in your development environment. But the database folder contains database related items. I'm just sort of looking through anything else we want to talk about here. I think that's all I'll talk about. Again, you can see just sort of a brief description of what each of these folders does, and you can sort of read through those. And of course, you can dig things up on the web that will really go into more detail about those things. So let's look at sort of how this works. Up to this point, we've created a new controller called Hello. We have a single action in that controller called index, and then we've got a single view that's also associated with that action that's called index. And remember, we saw that work the last time we were here. We just displayed the variables inside our view. Let's go back to here. So they were message count and bonus. I haven't done anything with this count variable yet. We'll look at that in a moment. But before we do that, let's sort of walk you through. This is a really good visual of what's going on here. Now, in your development environment, this cloud that's the internet, you can sort of take that out. I mean, your Puma, your local Puma web server represents the internet. Well, I shouldn't say that, because here's the web server block here. Essentially, that internet part of this, diagram does not exist in your development environment. But let's sort of walk you through what's going on here as we enter a web address, go through routing, controller view, processing, and then sort of go back to your updated or refreshed view. Okay, so we start off with we're working on your local environment. That's what the little computer here represents. So either your laptop or desktop, wherever you're at. So when I hit this refresh button, or if I come in here and type a route and hit return on my keyboard, that starts this request response cycle, if you will. And so when you think about web development, web servers, and what they do, that's essentially all they do is take requests and give responses. So when I come here and I type in, now in this case I'm typing in localhost :3000, but you can imagine facebook.com, ebay.com, twitter.com, anything like that. You can replace the localhost 3000 with whatever actual domain you're running on, and then put this entire route in here. So that starts the request. So you're sending a request to that web server that says, hey, give me what lives at mycoolwebsite.com/hello. So we go through the web server. Now in this case, again, the web server lives locally. In the case of going to an actual domain name, whatever web server that domain name lives at, that's the web server that's receiving that request. So first we start out with this routing piece, and if you remember, we touched our routes.rb file. So if we go here, so any request to a Rails app goes through this routes file. So in this case, since in our web browser we typed in /hello, essentially the web server and Rails is going to send that request to this routes file and say, hey, does this route exist in this app? So in this case, because I typed in hello, it does exist, and that's why we get a correct response. Now notice if I type /bye and hit return, notice that we get an error, a routing error, because the first place Rails goes is to that routes.rb file, and if it doesn't find that route, then notice we have this bye is loaded. Now notice that I could come here and I could type in bye and save that, and if I refresh this page, now notice our view works. Now why did that happen? Well, because this now becomes a valid route. All I did was change, instead of hello being a valid route, I changed it to bye. Now it still loaded the hello controller and the index action that's associated with that controller. So hopefully that makes sense. And now, of course, if I go to hello, so I'm just going to hit the back button and refresh. Notice hello is now an invalid route. So, there's no magic in URLs and what's going on here. It's just all that this sort of first step is controlled by the routes file. Okay, so I'm going to save that. And so that's the routing piece. Now we go to the controller. So once it's a valid route, remember this route is going to send it to some controller, in this case the hello controller, which we know about, and specifically the index action. So in this case, this code is loaded, okay? So that's the controller part. Now we go to the view processing, assuming that a valid controller is found and a valid action is found that is referenced by the routes file. Anything in that action is going to run or be loaded into memory, and then we move on to the associated index, the view that's associated with this particular action. In this case, and this is sort of a one-to-one correlation too. There's magic. That's some of the Rails magic, that because this action is named index, this view also should be named index. I could change the name of this action to blah, and if I change the name of this view to blah, then everything would sort of work the same way. All right, so back to our view. So now our view is processed. That request or that response is handed back to the web server, which in turn hands it back to your computer here. So in that split second when I just did that, every time I refresh this page, that cycle is repeating. Now that may seem onerous when you think about again, something like Facebook or eBay and the thousands of requests per second that they might get. But again, this with the amount of memory and the speed of servers, this all happens in milliseconds. And in fact, if I go to our server here, I can sort of see that. In fact, it happened in 13 milliseconds here. It happened in 21 milliseconds here. Now that may be different based on the speed of your local machine, and it's going to be different on the server for reasons we won't get into here. But just know that that this is sort of in a single diagram. This is everything that's happening really anytime. This is not just anytime you're in a Rails app and you're loading a page, this is sort of the process. So now let's look at this next example, figure 5 in the book. And so this is nice because it really sort of ties in our URL that we're looking at in our web browser, ties that into the controller name and the controller action. Now notice it's a little different than if you remember, we changed our route. Let's go and look really quick at our routes RB. Remember, we changed our route from this what it was before, this get hello /index, to this get hello, and then we're sort of sending that URL, that slash hello, we're sending that on to this hello hash index. And remember, if you remember correctly, we said the result of that is that when we're in the web browser here, we can refresh, and this sends us to the index action and index view in the hello controller. So this graphic just sort of walks us through that. Again, this first part of the URL is hello, and then this second part of the URL. Now in this case, we're not displaying, we don't actually have the term index up inside the URL, but again, the result is the same. That if you see here, this hello comes down, you see this is sending us to the hello underscore controller. If we look at what that's defined as in the actual in the hello controller, the name of that controller is hello, and then of course we have that this index method we said. We also call it in Rails, we call it an action. We have this index action defined inside our controller, and then if you notice, that ties us into this index view, which is located in the views and views/hello folder inside of our Rails app. And then of course the result down at the bottom is that we get this we get this page displayed inside Rails. Okay, so let's add some logic now. If you remember correctly, we're using our message and bonus variables, and let's double check that to make sure I'm not telling you a lie. Yeah, we're using this message and bonus variables, which we define inside our index action. We're not doing anything with count. So let's do some fun things in Ruby to maybe use that count. So we're going to do this next. We're going to add this code to our view, and this is example 7 here in the book. So I'm just going to copy this, go over to my index action, and paste that in. Save that. Now when I go and update here, notice we get a little different behavior, right? So what's actually going on here? So first off, we still have this h1 tag that's displaying the message variable. Remember we said the message variable was set to hello Barnabas. And then you notice this p tag, this paragraph tag, is just text. We're not doing anything special. In fact, we're not even doing anything in Ruby there. That's just straight HTML. Now notice we've got this little loop here, or block, and so there are multiple ways Ruby's really. Let me say a few things about Ruby and its syntax. So, oftentimes you'll hear about elegant syntax in Ruby, and that's one of the advantages of Ruby. It's really a fun language because there's a bunch of ways, and this is true in other languages too, but maybe more so in Ruby. Syntactically, there's a lot of different ways to do things in Ruby. So here is one example of a for loop in Ruby that's going to loop through a given number. Now in this case, what this says is, I'll just walk you through this. This is saying for I in, and then 1, and then this dot dot is a range, so it's saying 1 through whatever count is set to. In this case, count is set to 3. So this is saying for I in 1 through 3, I want you to print out the bonus variable. In this case, the bonus variable is this message came from the controller, and that's why we see this message came from the controller 3 times, right? I mean, if we came over here and changed count to 5 and saved it and then refresh, we're going to see this message came from a variable 5 times. Okay. So back on the syntax, the point I sort of wanted to drive home was that there's a lot of elegant ways to do things in Ruby. This can also be a downside. The robustness of the syntax is good from the standpoint of oftentimes you'll hear Ruby can read like the English language does, so it can be, again, an elegant way to do things, but it also means that you can run into a lot of syntax. I mean, I've been doing Ruby for over 5 years now, and I'll often run into some syntax that I'm like, wait, what? Because there's a bunch of different ways to do things. Now that syntax may make sense to someone else, and it may not to another person. So I would just say, I just say that to say, be careful about, and I'm saying this to more experienced Ruby developers to, be careful about how clever your code is. Clever code is nice, but it can also confuse other folks. So, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. So sometimes it's better to trade, maybe, and I'm just saying this, maybe sometimes it's better to trade efficiency for being more explicit about how you do something. So, uh, um, just think about when you start to create some clever or some sophisticated Ruby syntax, that sometimes the simpler way is the better way, just from the standpoint of other people being able to understand what it is you're trying to do. Okay, that's all I'll say about that. Okay, so we've sort of explained that, how that works. Okay, and that's it for chapter 2. We'll go on to chapter 3 in our next screencast. Thanks.